March 25, 1941. The Government Code and Cipher School at Bletchley Park, England. Inside a small cottage adjacent to the main mansion, a 19-year-old woman named Mavis Beatty hunched over sheets of paper covered in seemingly random letters. She had been working with a team of cryptanalysts for 3 days and nights, surviving on tea and biscuits, racing against time to decipher Italian naval signals. This young woman, barely out of university where she had been studying German, was about to change the course of naval warfare in the Mediterranean. The breakthrough came when she identified a message that read, "Today, 25 March is X-3. Her heart raced. If you get a message saying today -3, then you know something pretty big is afoot. She immediately understood. In 3 days, the Italian fleet would launch a major operation. Working with her colleague Margaret Rock, and under the guidance of the eccentric classical scholar and codebreaker Dilly Knox, Mavis and her team worked around the clock, their pencils scratching furiously across paper as they decoded message after message. What emerged was nothing less than the complete Italian battle plan. The Regia Marina was preparing to sortie into the eastern Mediterranean to intercept British convoys carrying troops and supplies to Greece. The decoded messages revealed ship dispositions, timing, even the exact composition of the Italian fleet. The battleship Vittorio Veneto would lead 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 13 destroyers in a sweep designed to destroy lightly protected British convoy routes. This intelligence, codenamed Ultra, was the most closely guarded secret of the war. The decrypted information was immediately forwarded to Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham, commander of the British Mediterranean Fleet in Alexandria, Egypt. What followed would become one of the most decisive naval battles of World War II, a confrontation that would demonstrate the devastating power of signals intelligence and forever change the balance of power in the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean Sea in early 1941 was a battleground where 3 empires contested for supremacy. The British Empire needed control of these waters to maintain its lifeline to India through the Suez Canal and to supply its forces in North Africa. For fascist Italy, the Mediterranean was Mare Nostrum, our sea, a domain Benito Mussolini believed was Italy's by historical right. The Germans, though primarily focused on their pending invasion of the Soviet Union, understood that British control of the Mediterranean threatened the entire Axis position in North Africa and the Balkans. The Italian Regia Marina had entered the war in June 1940 with a formidable fleet. Modern battleships, fast cruisers, and numerous destroyers gave Italy numerical superiority over the British Mediterranean fleet. The new Littorio-class battleships, including the Vittorio Veneto, displaced over 40,000 tons and mounted 9 15-inch guns. These were among the most modern capital ships in the world, faster than British battleships and equipped with excellent fire control systems. The Italian heavy cruisers were particularly impressive. The Zara-class cruisers, Zara, Fiume, Pola and Gorizia, were considered among the best protected heavy cruisers afloat. Unlike most treaty cruisers that sacrificed armour for speed, the Zaras mounted 6 inches of belt armour, enough to resist their own 8-inch shells at typical combat ranges. They looked magnificent, sleek predators built for Mediterranean warfare, but the Regia Marina laboured under crippling disadvantages that would prove fatal. Italy had gone to war unprepared. Mussolini's reckless decision to enter the conflict in June 1940 came when his navy needed at least 2 more years to remedy critical deficiencies. Most critically, Italian ships lacked radar. While the British had been developing and installing radar systems throughout the late 1930s, Italy had essentially ignored this revolutionary technology. Italian ships relied on optical rangefinders and human eyesight, capabilities that became worthless in darkness or poor visibility. The fuel situation was equally dire. Italy had entered the war with reserves of 800,000 tons of oil. By February 1941, 2/3 of that had been consumed. Every sortie had to be carefully rationed. Every steaming hour counted against dwindling reserves. The British blockade of both ends of the Mediterranean meant no resupply from overseas. Germany could provide some fuel, but Hitler's own oil situation was precarious, and every ton sent to Italy was a ton denied to the Wehrmacht. Perhaps most damaging was Italy's failure to develop naval aviation. The Regia Marina had no aircraft carriers. Pre-war rivalries between the Italian Air Force and Navy had resulted in the Air Force controlling all military aviation, including maritime patrol and reconnaissance. This meant the fleet could not provide its own air cover and had to rely on shore-based aircraft operating at extreme range. The limitations of this arrangement would prove catastrophic. The British, by contrast, had made night fighting a priority. Throughout the 1930s, the Royal Navy had conducted extensive night combat training, something most navies considered too dangerous and impractical. British ships practiced coordinated night attacks, using searchlights and star shells to illuminate targets while minimizing their own visibility. The addition of radar transformed night fighting from a dangerous gamble into a calculated advantage. British Type 284 radar sets could detect surface ships at ranges exceeding 10 miles, allowing commanders to position their forces with precision even in total darkness. The Mediterranean fleet also benefited from aggressive, imaginative leadership. Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham, known as ABC to his men, was a fighting sailor in the tradition of Nelson. Born in Dublin in 1883, Cunningham had joined the Royal Navy as a cadet at age 14 and had spent his entire adult life in naval service. He believed in aggressive action, in bringing the enemy to battle and destroying him. Cunningham understood that in a war of attrition against a numerically superior enemy, audacity and initiative were force multipliers as valuable as ships and guns. He had already demonstrated this in November 1940 with the attack on Taranto. 21 obsolescent Swordfish biplane torpedo bombers from the carrier HMS Illustrious had attacked the Italian fleet at anchor, sinking or severely damaging 3 battleships for the loss of just 2 aircraft. The attack had been modelled on British fleet air arm exercises and shocked the world with its effectiveness. The Japanese naval attaché in Rome sent detailed reports back to Tokyo, where they would inspire another carrier strike 13 months later at a place called Pearl Harbor. By March 1941, the strategic situation in the Mediterranean had reached a critical juncture. Germany was preparing to invade Greece to rescue Mussolini's failed Greek campaign that had begun the previous October. British forces were being rushed to Greece to support the Greek army, requiring a steady stream of convoys from Egypt. These convoys were vulnerable, protected only by cruisers and destroyers. If the Italian battle fleet could intercept one or more of these convoys, the slaughter would be immense. Italian naval headquarters, Super Marina, planned Operation Gaudo to do exactly that. Admiral Angelo Iachino, an experienced and competent officer, would take virtually the entire operational fleet to sea. The Vittorio Veneto would provide overwhelming firepower, while heavy cruisers and destroyers swept ahead, searching for British convoys. The plan was sensible, even elegant. Italian ships were faster than their British counterparts. If they could find the convoys before British battleships arrived, they could destroy them and withdraw before facing capital ships. The Germans had assured Super Marina that only 1 British battleship was operational in the eastern Mediterranean, and that the carrier HMS Illustrious had been severely damaged in January and was no longer operational. This intelligence was catastrophically wrong. The British actually had 3 operational battleships, Warspite, Valiant and Barham, all recently modernised. More importantly, the damaged Illustrious had been replaced by her sister ship, HMS Formidable, giving Cunningham a fully operational carrier with modern strike aircraft. But the Italian fleet's greatest vulnerability was not material, it was cryptographic. In September 1940, Mavis Beatty, working alone one night at Bletchley Park, had made a crucial breakthrough. The Italian Navy used Enigma machines for their communications, sophisticated electromechanical cipher devices that the Italians believed were unbreakable. Dilly Knox, the eccentric classical scholar who led the small research team, suspected the Italians were still using the same Enigma configuration they had used during the Spanish Civil War. He instructed his team to test standard cribs, educated guesses based on predictable message formats. Mavis tried the crib Perks, Italian for 4, with X indicating a space. Nothing. Against orders, she kept trying variations. Then she discovered PERS, the beginning of the word personal, meaning personal. The Italians were indeed using familiar procedures, but with slight modifications. This breakthrough allowed Knox's team to begin reading Italian naval traffic. Over the following months, they refined their techniques, building on Polish cryptanalytic work shared just before the war. By March 1941, they could read Italian naval Enigma messages, sometimes within hours of transmission. The Italians never suspected. They continued to rely on their supposedly unbreakable cipher machine, never imagining that every operational order, every movement report was being read by the enemy. On March 25th, when Mavis Beatty decoded the message indicating an operation would begin on March 28th, the British gained an advantage more valuable than additional ships or superior weapons. They knew exactly what the enemy intended to do. The decoded messages revealed that Italian heavy cruisers would sweep north of Crete, while the main body with Vittorio Veneto operated to the south. The timing, the routes, the radio frequencies, everything was laid bare. Admiral Cunningham received this intelligence with barely contained excitement. He later wrote that he was like a caged tiger, pacing the bridge of his flagship, focused single-mindedly on bringing the Italians to battle. This was the opportunity he had been seeking, a chance to engage the Italian fleet under favourable conditions. But Cunningham faced a critical challenge. He had to act on the ultra-intelligence without revealing that he possessed it. If the Italians suspected their codes were compromised, they would change them, blinding British intelligence. Every operation based on ultra had to have plausible alternative explanations. The British developed an elaborate deception to explain how they knew the Italian fleet was at sea. Reconnaissance aircraft would be prominently sent to search areas where ultra had revealed Italian ships would be. This would give the Italians a conventional explanation for British fleet movements. Cunningham himself participated in the deception. On the afternoon of March 27th, he made a point of arriving at the Alexandria Sporting Club with his suitcase, as if planning to spend the night. He played golf within sight of the Japanese consul, who was known to share information with the Axis. An evening party was advertised on his flagship HMS Warspite for that same night. Every detail was designed to suggest the British admiral was relaxing ashore, unaware of Italian fleet movements. In reality, Cunningham had already issued orders for the fleet to prepare for sea. As darkness fell, he slipped away from the club and boarded Warspite. The advertised party never took place. By midnight, the British Mediterranean fleet was at sea, steaming toward an intercept position south of Crete. The fleet Cunningham commanded represented the concentrated power of the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean. His flagship Warspite was a veteran of Jutland, but she had been extensively modernised in the 1930s. Her 8 15-inch guns could hurl a 1-ton shell nearly 20 miles. Her sister ships Valiant and Bareham were similarly equipped, giving Cunningham 24 15-inch guns. More importantly, all 3 battleships had been fitted with radar. The carrier HMS Formidable was less than 6 months old, commissioned in late 1940. She carried squadrons of Fairey Albacore and Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers. These were slow, obsolescent biplanes that looked like relics from the previous war. But they were stable, reliable platforms for torpedo attack, and in the hands of experienced fleet air-arm pilots, they were deadly. Vice Admiral Henry Pridham Whipple commanded the cruiser force, HMS Ajax, famous for her role in the Battle of the River Plate, HMS Orion, HMS Gloucester, and the Australian cruiser HMS Perth. These ships would act as scouts and bait, luring Italian heavy cruisers toward Cunningham's battleships. 13 destroyers completed the force, providing anti-submarine screens and ready for surface torpedo attacks. The pieces were moving into position for the largest fleet action in the Mediterranean since the First World War. The Italian fleet that sortied from multiple ports on March 27th was the largest concentration of the Regia Marina's power since the war began. Admiral Angelo Iacchino flew his flag from the Vittorio Veneto, a magnificent ship that represented the pinnacle of Italian naval design. Her 9 15-inch guns were housed in 3 triple turrets, giving her an intimidating broadside. She could make 30 knots, substantially faster than British battleships. Her fire control systems were excellent, capable of accurate shooting at extreme ranges in daylight. The heavy cruiser force was formidable. The Zara-class ships Zara, Fiume and Pola sailed with the 9th Destroyer Flotilla. These cruisers each mounted 8 8-inch guns in 4 twin turrets, and their heavy armour made them tough opponents. The Trento-class cruisers Trento, Trieste and Bolzano provided additional 8-inch gun firepower, though they traded armour for speed. 2 light cruisers and 13 destroyers completed the force. In total, Iacchino commanded 1 battleship, 8 cruisers and 13 destroyers. It was a powerful fleet, more than capable of overwhelming any convoy escort, but it sailed into a trap. On the morning of March 28th, the 2 fleets began their deadly dance. a British short Sunderland flying boat spotted the Italian fleet at noon, exactly as British intelligence had predicted. The sighting was radioed to Cunningham, giving the Italians a plausible explanation for British fleet movements. What the Italians didn't know was that Cunningham had been steaming toward this exact position for 12 hours, guided by decoded Italian radio messages. At 6:35 a.m., an Italian float plane launched from Vittorio Veneto spotted Pridham Whipple's cruiser squadron south of Gavdos Island. The sighting was reported to Iachino, who ordered his heavy cruisers to engage. This was exactly what Cunningham wanted. The British cruisers would lure Italian ships toward the waiting battleships. At 7:55 a.m., the Italian heavy cruisers Trento, Trieste and Bolzano made contact with the British cruisers. The Italians had superior speed and firepower. Their 8-inch guns outranged the British light cruisers' 6-inch weapons. The engagement that followed was a running fight as the British cruisers fled south at maximum speed, drawing the Italian heavies after them. HMS Gloucester took several hits but remained operational. The Italian gunnery was accurate, their range-finding excellent in the clear Mediterranean light. But then, at 8:12 a.m., the British cruisers reversed course and began chasing the Italian ships. The Italians, confused by this sudden aggression, turned back north. They didn't know that the British cruisers had just spotted Vittorio Veneto and that Pridham Whipple was now trying to get his ships out of range of the battleship's 15-inch guns. The Vittorio Veneto opened fire at 11:00 a.m. from a range of over 25,000 yards. Her massive shells threw up towering columns of water around the British cruisers. For 15 minutes, the Italian battleship maintained fire, expending 94 15-inch shells. The spread was too wide and only slight damage was inflicted on Perth and Orion. The British cruisers laid smoke and fled south at maximum speed. They were hopelessly outgunned, but they had accomplished their mission. The Italian fleet had been drawn southeast, directly toward Cunningham's battleships. Throughout the morning, Italian reconnaissance aircraft had been searching for the British main fleet. They failed to find it. British ships were maintaining strict radio silence, making detection difficult. The Italians assumed British battleships were still in Alexandria. This assumption was about to prove fatal. At 11:27 a.m. the first British airstrike arrived. 6 Fairey Albacore torpedo bombers from Formidable, escorted by 2 Fairey Fulmar fighters, attacked the Italian fleet. The slow, fabric-covered biplanes looked like easy targets. Italian ships put up a wall of anti-aircraft fire, their guns filling the sky with bursting shells. The Albacores pressed through the barrage, their pilots holding steady despite the violence around them. No hits were scored on this attack, but the strike forced the Italian ships to maneuver violently, disrupting their formation. More importantly, it confirmed to Iachino that a British carrier was operating nearby. He immediately requested air support from shore-based fighters. The request went from his flagship to Super Marina in Rome, then to the Italian Air Force Command, then to German Air Force headquarters in Sicily. This cumbersome chain of command meant that effective air support would be hours away, if it came at all. Iachino, realizing his fleet was in danger without air cover, ordered a withdrawal. At midday, the Italian fleet turned west, heading for home. But Cunningham was not going to let them escape. At 3:19 p.m., a second strike from Formidable attacked the Vittorio Veneto. The torpedo bombers, flying barely above the wavetops, pressed their attack through concentrated anti-aircraft fire. One aircraft, piloted by Lieutenant Commander Daliel Stead, released its torpedo and then flew directly over the battleship at masthead height before being shot down by anti-aircraft guns. All 3 crew members were killed. But the sacrifice was not in vain. One torpedo struck Vittorio Veneto on the port side near the stern. The explosion was enormous. The 250-pound warhead blew a 30-foot hole in the battleship's hull below the waterline. Seawater flooded into multiple compartments. The propeller shafts were damaged and the ship lost all power. For 15 minutes, Vittorio Veneto drifted dead in the water. Italian damage control parties worked frantically, shoring up bulkheads, pumping out flooded spaces, restoring power. Slowly, painfully, they got the ship moving again, but her maximum speed was now reduced to 19 knots, barely faster than Cunningham's pursuing battleships. Iachino radioed for air support, for submarines, for anything that could slow the British pursuit. He ordered his heavy cruisers to form a protective screen around the damaged battleship. If British ships closed within gun range, the Italian cruisers would have to buy time for Vittorio Veneto to escape. even at the cost of their own destruction. A third airstrike was launched at 7:36 p.m. as darkness began to fall. 6 albacores from Formidable and 2 swordfish from Crete attacked in the gathering dusk. The Italian fleet was ready, deploying in 3 columns with searchlights and a massive anti-aircraft barrage designed to protect the Vittorio Veneto. The attacking aircraft pressed through walls of fire. The noise was incredible, the sky filled with tracers and bursting shells. In the confusion and darkness, one torpedo struck not the Vittorio Veneto but the heavy cruiser Pola. The torpedo hit midships, knocking out 5 of her 8 boilers and severing the main steam line. The cruiser lost all electrical power. In total darkness, with no propulsion and no power for pumps or damage control, Pola drifted to a halt. Her captain sent a report to Iachino that she was immobilized. This message would seal the fate of 3 cruisers and over 2,300 men. Iachino faced an agonizing decision. Every instinct told him to maintain course for home. His flagship was damaged, the British fleet was pursuing, and darkness would soon make air support impossible. But Italian naval tradition demanded that he not abandon a disabled ship. At 8:10 p.m. he made his decision. The heavy cruisers Zara and Fiume, along with 4 destroyers of the 9th Flotilla, were ordered to return and take Pola in tow. They were to proceed at 16 knots to conserve fuel and complete the rescue before dawn. This order, born of courage and honour, was a death sentence. The ships ordered back were sailing without radar, without air cover, without any awareness that British battleships were just miles away, tracking them on radar. Captain Luigi Corsi, commanding Zara, never questioned the order. This was his duty. The Zara-class cruisers had been designed to lead the Italian fleet to take on any opponent. Their heavy armour would protect them from destroyer attacks, and they would reach Pola, take her under tow and return to port before daylight brought British air attacks. Fiume and 4 destroyers formed up with Zara. The small force turned in the darkness and began steaming back toward Pola at 16 knots. On board the ships, sailors were at action stations but had no idea what awaited them. Meanwhile, on the bridge of HMS Warspite, Admiral Cunningham was receiving a steady stream of radar reports. His battleships were tracking multiple Italian ships. One was stopped, presumably damaged. Others were approaching the stopped ship from the northwest. Cunningham immediately understood the tactical situation. The Italians were attempting a rescue. This gave him an opportunity to bring his battleships into gun range of Italian cruisers. He ordered his fleet to a course that would intercept the Italian rescue force. 3 battleships, Warspite, Valiant and Barham, steamed through the darkness in line-ahead formation. Cunningham gave strict orders. No ship was to open fire, to use searchlights, or to make smoke until he gave the command. Surprise was essential. British destroyers were sent ahead to scout and to be ready for torpedo attacks. At 10:10 p.m, lookouts on the stopped Pola spotted shapes approaching in the darkness. They assumed these were their rescuers and fired a red signal flare to guide them in. The flare illuminated Pola for a moment, clearly visible to British ships just miles away. Cunningham ordered his battleships to turn toward the Italian ships. On the bridges of Zara and Fiume, officers peered into the darkness, straining to see Pola. They had no idea British battleships were less than 2 miles away, tracking them on radar. At 10:25 p.m, HMS Valiant's radar detected the Italian cruisers at a range of 4,000 yards. The British battleships were crossing the Italian line of advance at nearly perpendicular angles. Cunningham manoeuvred to bring his ships broadside to the enemy, all guns able to bear. At 10:27 p.m, HMS Greyhound, a British destroyer, suddenly illuminated Fiume with her searchlight. For an instant, the Italian cruiser was caught in brilliant light, every detail visible. Then the British battleships opened fire. The range was 2,900 yards, barely over. A mile. At this distance, battleship guns could not miss. Warspite's 6 15-inch guns fired first, a rippling broadside that lit up the night. 5 shells struck Fiume within seconds. 1 penetrated the engine room, others detonated against the superstructure and turrets. The rear superfiring turret was blown completely off the ship, tumbling through the air to crash into the sea. Fiume's hull rang like a vast bell, the impact of multiple 1-ton shells literally tearing the cruiser apart. Valiant and Barham added their fire. 15 15-inch guns, firing from a range where they could not miss. Fiume was hit again and again, at least 15 times in the first minute. Fires erupted across the ship. The cruiser slewed to starboard, her steering destroyed, Her engines stopped. Her crew abandoned ship as flames consumed her. The British battleships shifted fire to Zara. Caught in searchlight beams, the Italian flagship of the rescue force had no chance to manoeuvre or return effective fire. British 15-inch shells struck her bridge, her turrets, her engine rooms. The concentrated firepower was overwhelming. Zara's heavy armour, designed to resist 8-inch shells at battle ranges, offered no protection against 15-inch shells at point-blank range. The massive projectiles punched through her side armour as if it were paper. Captain Corsi on Zara's bridge realised instantly that his ship was doomed. He gave the order to abandon ship, but many men never heard it. The ship's electrical systems had failed, plunging the interior into darkness. Men groped through smoke-filled compartments, seeking escape routes as fires spread and flooding increased. The slaughter lasted 5 minutes. 3 British battleships had fired 38 15-inch shells, virtually everyone a hit. 2 Italian heavy cruisers had been reduced to burning wrecks in the time it takes to make a cup of tea. The Italian destroyers tried to fight back. Vittorio Alfieri and Giosuè Carducci, charging toward the British battleships, launched torpedoes and engaged with their 4.7-inch guns. It was a courageous but futile gesture. British destroyers HMS Griffin and HMS Greyhound engaged them with gunfire. The Italian destroyer Alfieri was hit repeatedly and sank at 10:32 p.m., just minutes after the action began. Carducci fought on for a few more minutes before she too was overwhelmed, sinking at 10:35 p.m. 2 other Italian destroyers, Oriani and Gioberti, managed to escape in the confusion, laying smoke and fleeing at maximum speed. Oriani carried heavy damage but stayed afloat. British destroyers gave chase but lost them in the darkness. Now only Pola remained. The stopped cruiser, immobilised by the earlier torpedo hit, waited helplessly in the darkness. British destroyers found her at 11:30 p.m. The destroyer HMS Havoc illuminated Pola with a searchlight, expecting to find a wreck ready to sink. Instead, she appeared virtually undamaged, just stopped. A boarding party was organised. British sailors approached, Pola in boats, uncertain what they would find. The scene that greeted them was surreal. About 200 Italian sailors were still on board, many of them drunk. They had broken into the ship's wine stores, knowing their ship was doomed. Some were soaking wet, having jumped overboard earlier and then climbed back aboard when no rescue appeared. They were shivering, drinking wine to stay warm, waiting for whatever came. The British sailors treated their defeated enemies with respect, helping them into boats and transferring them to British destroyers. There was no time to salvage anything from Pola. Dawn was approaching, and German dive bombers would soon be overhead. At 3:30 a.m. on March 29th, British destroyers fired torpedoes into Pola. The heavy cruiser rolled over and sank, taking with her the bodies of over 300 men who had died in the earlier torpedo attack. As dawn broke, Cunningham's fleet was still in dangerous waters. The Vittorio Veneto had escaped during the night, limping back to Italy. Italian submarines were in the area, and German aircraft based in Sicily and Rhodes were certain to attack. But first, there were survivors to rescue. The waters around the battle site were filled with Italian sailors clinging to wreckage, swimming in oil-covered seas. Many were wounded. All were exhausted. Cunningham ordered his destroyers to begin rescue operations. British and Australian sailors pulled Italian sailors from the water, hundreds of them. They worked quickly, knowing German aircraft would arrive soon. The scene was chaotic. Men swimming toward rescue ships, others too weak to help themselves, bodies floating among the debris. By 8 a.m. about 900 Italian sailors had been rescued. Then German dive bombers arrived. Junkers Ju-88s from bases in Rhodes began attacking the British ships. Cunningham faced a terrible choice: continue rescue operations and risk his ships, or abandon the survivors and withdraw. He chose to withdraw, but not before transmitting the position of the remaining survivors on an open channel that he knew the Italians would intercept. He specifically granted safe passage to any Italian hospital ship sent to rescue survivors. The Italian hospital ship Gradisca arrived later that day and rescued an additional 160 men. In total, about 115 Italian sailors were rescued by British and Australian ships, and another 160 by Italian vessels. But the cost had been terrible. Over 2,300 Italian sailors died in the battle, most of them from Zara and Fiume. The 3 heavy cruisers were the pride of the Italian fleet, and now all 3 were on the bottom of the Mediterranean. 2 destroyers had also been sunk. British losses were 3 men, the crew of a single Albacore torpedo bomber shot down during the afternoon airstrikes. The asymmetry was staggering, one of the most one-sided fleet actions in naval history. The strategic consequences were immediate and profound. The Battle of Cape Matapan broke the Italian Navy, not just materially, though the loss of 3 heavy cruisers was a devastating blow, but psychologically. The Italian fleet had been ambushed and destroyed without warning. The night battle had revealed Italian technical inferiority in the most brutal way possible. Ships without radar had been slaughtered by radar-equipped opponents. Italian naval commanders had to confront the reality that they could not compete with British technology and tactics. Admiral Iachino, in his post-battle report, was brutally honest. The battle had revealed Italian inferiority in effective aeronaval cooperation and the backwardness of Italian night battle technology. These were not temporary problems that could be quickly fixed. Radar development and production would take years. Effective naval aviation required carriers, which Italy did not have and could not build in time to matter. The Italian Navy essentially withdrew from offensive operations after Matapan. The fleet remained a threat in being, forcing the British to keep battleships in the Mediterranean. But Italian ships rarely ventured far from their bases. When they did go to sea, it was for convoy escort or defensive operations, not aggressive fleet actions. The transformation of German opinion about their Italian ally was swift. German military reports began openly questioning Italian naval effectiveness. In private conversations, German officers expressed frustration with what they saw as Italian timidity. The relationship between Rome and Berlin, never warm, grew colder. For the British, Matapan was a triumph that validated multiple tactical and technological innovations. Carrier-based aviation had proven its worth, with slow torpedo bombers disabling a modern battleship. Radar had transformed night fighting from a dangerous gamble into a calculated advantage. The integration of air power with surface forces had created synergies that multiplied combat effectiveness. Perhaps most important was the validation of signals intelligence. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park had made the victory possible. Without ultra-intelligence, Cunningham would not have known the Italian fleet was at sea. The British Mediterranean fleet might have been caught out of position, unable to intercept. British convoys might have been slaughtered. Instead, advance warning had allowed perfect positioning. The impact on morale at Bletchley Park was enormous. For the most part, the codebreakers worked in isolation, never knowing if their efforts made any difference. They decoded messages, sent them to military commanders, and heard nothing back. Operational security demanded this isolation, but it was psychologically difficult. A few weeks after the battle, Admiral Cunningham himself visited Bletchley Park. He went to the small cottage where Dilly Knox's team worked and personally thanked Mavis Beatty and her colleagues. He told them that they had won a great victory in the Mediterranean and that it was entirely due to them. Mavis later recalled that their sense of elation knew no bounds. For young women who'd been recruited straight from university, who worked long hours for little pay in cramped cold buildings, this recognition was transformative. They understood, perhaps for the first time, that their work was changing the course of the war. Admiral John Godfrey, the Director of Naval Intelligence, sent a message to Bletchley Park that became famous within the intelligence community. "Tell Dilly that we have won a great victory in the Mediterranean and it is entirely due to his girls." The phrase Dilly's girls became a badge of honour. Dilly Knox himself, dying of cancer and unable to travel to Bletchley Park regularly, received the news at his home. He composed a poem celebrating the victory, including lines specifically honouring Mavis Beatty, calling her a rare bird, a black swan. The strategic situation in the Mediterranean after Matapan shifted decisively in Britain's favour. The Italian fleet's withdrawal from offensive operations meant British convoys could operate with reduced escorts. More ships could be devoted to offensive operations rather than defensive convoy protection. Malta, the British island fortress in the central Mediterranean, remained viable as an offensive base. Ships and submarines operating from Malta savaged Axis convoys to North Africa, strangling Rommel's supply lines. Without the threat of Italian fleet intervention, these operations became more aggressive and more effective. The evacuation of British forces from Greece and Crete in April and May 1941, while costly, was not contested by the Italian surface fleet. Cunningham's ships operated under constant air attack, but without fear of Italian battleships appearing over the horizon. The psychological impact of Matapan extended far beyond the Mediterranean. The battle demonstrated that technological and tactical advantages could offset numerical inferiority. The Royal Navy was outnumbered in the Mediterranean, but superior technology, better training, and aggressive leadership had produced a decisive victory. This lesson influenced Allied naval thinking throughout the war. In the Pacific, the US Navy paid close attention to the lessons of Matapan, the importance of radar, of carrier aviation, of night fighting capabilities. All these were validated by Cunningham's victory. American naval tactics incorporated these lessons, with radar-directed gunnery and coordinated air-surface operations becoming standard procedure. The Japanese, who had observers in Italy, drew their own conclusions. The vulnerability of ships without radar-to-night attacks was noted. So was the effectiveness of torpedo bombers against capital ships. These observations influenced Japanese naval development, though ultimately not enough to offset American advantages in radar and industrial production. For Admiral Angelo Iachino, Matapan was a professional tragedy. He had led his fleet competently, had made reasonable decisions based on the intelligence available to him. He could not have known that British codebreakers were reading his messages. He could not have anticipated that British battleships would track his cruisers on radar in complete darkness. Yet the battle occurred under his command, and responsibility was his. In Italy, there was controversy about his decision to send Zara and Fiume back to rescue Pola. Some critics argued that he should have abandoned the disabled cruiser and maintained course for home. Others defended the decision as correct by the standards of naval honour and tradition. Iachino himself maintained that the outcome was determined not by his decisions, but by Italian technical inferiority. In his report, he emphasised that the battle had revealed Italian backwardness in night fighting technology and lack of effective air-naval cooperation. These were systemic problems that no individual admiral could solve. He retained his command and continued to lead the Italian fleet, but always with the memory of Matapan haunting him. For the survivors, the battle left deep psychological scars. Italian sailors who had been pulled from the oil-covered waters spoke of the terror of the night battle, of massive shells arriving without warning, of ships disintegrating in minutes. Many suffered from what would later be recognised as post-traumatic stress. The survivors from Pola had a different experience. They had waited helplessly on a dead ship, knowing rescue might never come, ultimately being captured by an enemy who treated them with unexpected decency. British sailors who participated in the rescue operations spoke with respect about their Italian counterparts. Many remembered individual acts of courage, Italian sailors helping wounded comrades into rescue boats, officers maintaining discipline even in defeat. The mutual respect between professional sailors transcended national animosity. The fate of the 3 heavy cruisers became a source of particular grief in Italy. These were not just warships, but symbols of national prestige. The Zara-class cruisers had been celebrated in propaganda as examples of Italian naval supremacy. Their destruction in a single night was a humiliation that Italian propaganda struggled to explain. Initial Italian reports minimized the disaster, claiming only 1 cruiser lost and damage to others. But the truth could not be hidden. Too many sailors never came home. Too many families received notices that their sons, husbands and fathers had died in the waters south of Crete. The Italian public's faith in their navy, never particularly strong, evaporated. The regime could not explain how 3 modern cruisers had been destroyed without inflicting any damage on British ships. The disparity was too stark, the defeat too complete. In Britain, Matapan was celebrated as a major victory, though the ultra-secret meant the full story could not be told. Newspapers reported a great naval triumph in the Mediterranean. Admiral Cunningham was praised for his aggressive leadership. The contributions of Formidable's air crews were highlighted, with particular mention of Lieutenant Commander Daniel Stead, who had given his life to torpedo the Vittorio Veneto. But the public could not be told that codebreakers had read Italian plans. That secret had to be protected at all costs. The cover story emphasised British reconnaissance aircraft spotting the Italian fleet and Cunningham's brilliant tactical response. This version was substantially true, just incomplete. At Bletchley Park, work continued. The success of Matapan validated the importance of their mission, but also increased the pressure. Knox's team continued breaking Italian naval codes, providing intelligence that guided British operations throughout 1941 and 1942. The information was always carefully protected. Every operation based on ultra-intelligence had to have plausible alternative explanations. Reconnaissance flights were staged, radio direction finding was emphasized, anything to avoid revealing that codes were being read. Mavis Beatty continued her work, eventually moving from Italian naval codes to other cryptographic challenges. She worked on diplomatic codes, breaking the cipher used by the German Abwehr intelligence service. Her work remained secret for decades. It was only in the 1970s, when the ultra-secret was finally revealed, that her contributions became public knowledge. The technological lessons of Matapan accelerated existing programs. The British expanded radar production, fitting more ships with increasingly sophisticated sets. Type 284 gunnery radar was supplemented by improved systems with greater range and accuracy. Night fighting doctrine was refined and expanded, with more ships receiving specialized training. The success of torpedo bomber attacks validated the Fleet Air Arms approach. Despite their antiquated appearance, Swordfish and Albacore aircraft proved effective against surface ships. Their slow speed, initially considered a liability, actually made them more stable platforms for torpedo release. Pilots could make more precise attacks. The fabric-covered airframes were also surprisingly resistant to damage. Cannon shells often passed through without detonating, while metal aircraft might have suffered catastrophic structural failure from the same hits. The Italian response to Matapan focused on addressing revealed deficiencies. Radar development was accelerated, but Italian industry lacked the manufacturing capacity and technical expertise to produce effective systems quickly. Experimental radar sets were installed on some ships by late 1941, but they were inferior to British equipment and produced in small numbers. Efforts to improve air-naval cooperation founded on institutional rivalries. The Italian Air Force remained unwilling to subordinate maritime aviation to naval control. Shore-based aircraft continued to operate independently, often failing to provide timely support to naval operations. The Germans, increasingly involved in Mediterranean air operations, proved more reliable than Italian air support. Fuel shortages worsened throughout 1941 and 1942. Every ton of oil consumed was irreplaceable. The Italian fleet became increasingly constrained, able to sortie only for the most critical operations. By 1942, major surface operations virtually ceased. The fleet remained in port, a wasting asset that consumed resources without contributing to the war effort. The ships became targets for Allied air attacks. The incomplete carrier Aquila, which might have partially addressed Italian naval aviation deficiencies, was never finished. Work continued sporadically, but the ship never became operational. Italy surrendered in September 1943 with Aquila still incomplete. The human cost of Matapan was concentrated in a few terrible hours. The 2,300 Italian dead came overwhelmingly from 3 ships destroyed in 5 minutes of close-range gunnery. The concentration of casualties in such a brief period made the disaster particularly traumatic for Italian naval families. Small towns that had contributed many sailors to a single ship's crew suffered disproportionately. In some communities, nearly every family lost someone. The grief was compounded by the manner of death. Men had drowned in darkness, trapped in rapidly sinking ships, or burned in spreading fires. Many bodies were never recovered. Families had no graves to visit, only memories and official notices of death. The British dead, 3 Fleet Air Arm crewmen, were honoured, but their sacrifice was proportionally smaller. Their aircraft had been shot down during the afternoon torpedo attack. The crew, Lieutenant Commander Daliel Stead, Lieutenant Cook, and Petty Officer Blenkhorn, were all killed when their Albacore was hit by anti-aircraft fire. Their torpedo hit contributed to the Vittorio Veneto's damage and ultimately to the opportunity for the night battle. Their families received the same notification letters that went to thousands of British service families, informing them of death in action. They were buried at sea. Their bodies never recovered. The contrast between British and Italian casualties reflected the technological and tactical asymmetry of the battle. The British had achieved complete surprise, had used superior technology to gain overwhelming advantage, and had executed a nearly perfect night ambush. The Italians had fought bravely but had never had a chance. Their ships were technologically outmatched, their tactical situation hopeless from the moment British battleships appeared on radar screens. Individual courage could not compensate for systemic disadvantages. In the decades after the war, historians have debated the relative importance of various factors in the British victory. Some emphasise ultra-intelligence as decisive, arguing that without decoded Italian messages, Cunningham could never have positioned his fleet for the perfect intercept. Others stressed technological advantages, particularly radar, which enabled the devastating night action. Still others credit British tactical doctrine and aggressive leadership. The truth is that all these factors were necessary. Ultra-intelligence provided warning and allowed optimal positioning. Radar enabled the night battle. Aggressive leadership ensured the advantage was exploited. Remove any one element and the outcome might have been different. The Italian perspective has evolved over time. Immediate post-war Italian naval historians tended to emphasize material disadvantages, particularly the lack of radar, as explaining the defeat. This interpretation had the advantage of preserving Italian honor, shifting blame to industrial and political leadership rather than sailors and officers. Later, historians have been more critical, questioning strategic decisions and operational planning. The decision to sortie without effective air cover has been particularly criticized. Some argue that Super Marina should have recognized the risk and either provided adequate air support or cancelled the operation. The decision to send Zara and Fiume back to rescue Pola remains controversial, with some historians arguing it was a noble but fatal decision. Modern analysis using computer simulations and detailed tactical reconstructions has confirmed that the Italian rescue force had virtually no chance of survival once British battleships were in position. The radar-directed gunnery at close range was simply too accurate. Italian cruisers, even with their heavy armour, could not survive multiple 15-inch shell hits at point-blank range. The only way the Italian ships might have escaped was to detect the British battleships earlier and withdraw at high speed. Without radar, this was impossible. The battle validated the importance of sensors in modern naval warfare. The side that could detect the enemy first and track them accurately had an overwhelming advantage. The legacy of Matapan extended throughout the war and beyond. For the Royal Navy, it remained a cherished victory, an example of how professionalism, technology, and aggressive spirit could overcome numerical inferiority. Cunningham's reputation was secured. He went on to command Allied naval forces in the Mediterranean during the invasions of North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. He ended the war as First Sea Lord, the professional head of the Royal Navy. For the Italian Navy, Matapan was a wound that never fully healed. The defeat coloured Italian naval operations for the remainder of the war. The reluctance to risk major surface units, already present due to fuel shortages, became absolute after Matapan. The fleet's potential was never fully realised, and it surrendered in 1943, having failed to decisively influence the Mediterranean campaign. For Mavis Beatty and her colleagues at Bletchley Park, Matapan provided validation and motivation that sustained them through years of demanding, often tedious, work. They understood that their efforts saved lives and changed battles. The secrecy imposed on them meant they could not speak of their accomplishments for decades. Mavis Beatty maintained her silence about Ultra until the secret was officially revealed in the 1970s. Even then, she spoke modestly about her role, emphasizing the team effort and downplaying her individual contributions. Only late in her life did she receive appropriate recognition, including the appointment as Member of the Order of the British Empire in 1987 for her wartime service. The Battle of Cape Matapan stands as one of the decisive engagements of World War II, not because it immediately changed the course of the war, but because it permanently altered the balance of power in the Mediterranean. The destruction of Italian naval power enabled British operations that would have been impossible with an active, aggressive Italian fleet. Malta survived as an offensive base. Convoys to North Africa operated with reduced escorts. The amphibious invasions of Sicily and Italy faced no Italian fleet opposition. All of these operations traced their origins, in part, to that night in March 1941 when British battleships appeared out of darkness and destroyed 3 Italian cruisers in 5 minutes of devastating gunnery. The human stories embedded in the battle deserve remembrance. The young codebreaker working through the night to decode Italian messages, the carrier pilot pressing his torpedo attack through walls of anti-aircraft fire, the Italian cruiser captain leading his ships back to rescue a disabled consort, knowing the danger but unable to abandon his duty. The British destroyer crew pulling exhausted Italian sailors from oil-covered water, the Italian families who received notification that their sons would not return. These individual experiences, multiplied across thousands of participants, constitute the human reality of naval warfare. The technological revolution that Matapan exemplified continued throughout the war. radar systems became more sophisticated, more compact, more powerful. By 1945, ships carried multiple radar sets for different purposes: air search, surface search, fire control, navigation. The integration of a radar with other technologies, particularly with analog fire control computers, created weapon systems of unprecedented accuracy. The face of naval warfare changed permanently. The era when battles were decided by optical gunnery and seamanship gave way to an age where electronic warfare, sensors, and guided weapons dominated. The intelligence dimension of warfare, glimpsed at Matapan, became increasingly important. Both sides invested enormous resources in signals intelligence, attempting to read enemy codes while protecting their own communications. The cryptographic war paralleled the shooting war, with breakthroughs and setbacks on both sides. The Allied advantage in breaking Axis codes, particularly German and Italian naval codes, provided intelligence that influenced countless operations. The Battle of the Atlantic, the Pacific submarine campaign, tactical air operations all benefited from signals intelligence derived from techniques pioneered by codebreakers like Mavis Beatty and her colleagues. In the broader narrative of World War II, Matapan occupies a significant but not central position. It was not as large as Jutland, not as strategically decisive as Midway, not as costly as the Atlantic convoy battles. But within the Mediterranean theatre, it was the battle that broke Italian naval power and secured British maritime supremacy. That supremacy enabled everything that followed: the defence of Egypt, the campaign in North Africa, the invasion of Sicily, the landing at Salerno, the supply of Malta, the evacuation from Greece and Crete. None of these operations would have been possible if the Italian fleet had remained an active, aggressive threat. The lessons of Matapan resonated in subsequent naval development. The importance of radar was universally recognised. Every major navy invested in radar development and deployment. The value of naval aviation was confirmed, leading to massive expansion of carrier forces, particularly by the United States. The importance of signals intelligence became a permanent feature of naval warfare, with cryptographic organizations becoming integral parts of naval establishments. The integration of air, surface, and subsurface forces into coordinated operations became standard doctrine, replacing older concepts of independent surface action. For the sailors who fought the battle, whether British or Italian, the experience remained vivid for the rest of their lives. Veterans of the night action spoke of the intensity, the confusion, the sudden violence of close-range gunnery. British sailors remembered the shock of seeing Italian ships illuminated by searchlights, already doomed before they could react. Italian survivors remembered the terror of massive shells arriving without warning, of ships disintegrating around them, of swimming through burning oil toward uncertain rescue. These memories, carried by thousands of men, became part of the collective memory of naval warfare. Stories told and retold in veterans' organizations, naval museums, and family gatherings. The physical artifacts of the battle rest on the Mediterranean seafloor. The wrecks of Zara, Fiume, and Pola lie in relatively deep water south of Crete, along with the destroyers Alfieri and Carducci. These sites are war graves, protected by international convention. Occasional expeditions have documented the wrecks, revealing the extent of the damage inflicted in those 5 terrible minutes. The ships remain, as they sank, monuments to the men who died aboard them, and testaments to the destructive power of modern naval warfare